I'm totally delighted to introduce you and to ask you to come up and
Oh, good. I tried to get not a cute one, but this was all I had lying around. So, yeah. I'm going to take advantage of having been given this podium to speak on Halloween to tell you about what terrifies me. And in doing so, I wish to speak more from my heart than from my head. And this will require me to stick my neck out a little bit, so not to give a traditional book talk. If there's controversy, I just ask that you remember the irony contained herein. This book took me 6 years to finish. It was supposed to be my easy and marketable third book in a trade press after 2 academic books about banking and inequality. This will be easy, said my Norm editor, Gary Dorfman's son. Just write about private equity, he said, and how neoliberal financial markets have led to inequality. Easy. But see, I began writing this book sometime after I started losing sleep, caused by my fellow Americans' increased appetite for fascism and its fellow travelers, racism, misogyny, and other fundamentalisms. And it just so happens that I have a very visceral understanding and thus fear of fascism. I was born in Iran in 1978 at the dawn of a revolution in which the whole of the Iranian population took to the streets to oust a corrupt monarch, Shah. By the time I could walk, the revolution had succeeded in ousting the Shah and failed catastrophically to free Iran. Before I could speak, the fascists had taken over. The fascists had taken over. The fascists whose solution was to keep killing people until the problem was solved. By the time I was aware of what was going on, the regime launched the nation into the bloodiest conflict it had ever experienced with Iraq, wherein hundreds of thousands of young martyrs on both sides launched as cannon fodder. We slept in our basements with gas masks as Tehran was bombed at night. They hung dissidents on the streets during the day, and in school we learned regime propaganda and shouted, Marg bar America, Marg bar Israel, Marg bar Saddam, death to America, death to Israel, death to Saddam, every morning and during recess and before lunch. A third of Iran's college-educated adults were tortured and imprisoned, including my mother, who was given a 15-year sentence when I was 4 years old and whisked off to prison to be tortured for having publicly opposed the war that was killing Iran's boys. For a stroke of luck, my mom would say a miracle, she got out of prison after 4 years and before the 1988 order that killed most of the women she was sentenced with. We left the country of war and fascism to the land where there was no war or fascism, America, and got political asylum here, got very lucky again. So anyway, I was deep into writing this monster of a book, and instead of finishing it on deadline, I kept writing more and reading more, and there was this one chapter, chapter 2, about the global anti-colonial revolts of the 1960s that linked up to the American civil rights movement that I argued were the political crisis that spawned the ideology of neoliberalism. And instead of just editing and wrapping up this short chapter, I found myself following every thread and going down every single rabbit hole about OPEC, military-industrial complex, the end of Bretton Woods, the creation of the fake Nobel in economics, et cetera, et cetera. And at one point, chapter 2 was a whole book, like 100,000 words, and Daniel, my editor, was not happy with me. By the way, that's another thesis of the book, for those deep in the scholarly debates about neoliberalism, that neoliberalism, our reigning political ideology, was not, as some scholars have described it, a backlash to state spending and inflation, but rather it was forged by Western politicians in the face of a global anti-colonial revolt after World War II and the collapse of European empires. In other words, neoliberalism did not emerge as an economic response against socialism, collectivism, or Keynesian New Dealism. Its purpose was to preserve an unjust world economic order. And it became state policy during the Nixon administration, not the Reagan administration. In other words, the problem that neoliberalism was deployed to fix was not inflation, state overspending, but the demands of the former colonies for control over their resources. Neoliberalism solved the problem of how the Seven Sisters oil companies in the Middle East, and Kennecott Copper in Chile, and De Beers Diamonds in South Africa would maintain their extraction-based profits after the colonies became sovereign nations. See, for 500 years, I'm not going to use all these slides because this is not a traditional book talk. A handful of European nations controlled the rest of the globe, and the drastic inequalities and violence of empire required justifying ideologies, and a few of these were used over time. So at first it was The divine right of kings allowed for 5-7 European nations to control everyone else, or the natural law wherein some god out there deemed only certain white men endowed with rights and only certain uses of land, proper uses of land. And then there was a pseudoscience of phrenology and superstitions about racial hierarchy, human progress, and so-called advancement of certain races. But when one of these very advanced races, Nazi Germany, used those same theories to commit savagery, unlike anything the world had ever seen, well, empire lost its alibi, but not its motive. For the British, still needed cheap Iranian oil, and Kandahar still needed full control of Chile's copper reserves, and South African gold mines required cheap labor, which in turn relied on apartheid regimes that were increasingly falling out of favor. And so it was these companies and the intellectuals they funded that really began the scramble to find new academic theories that would serve as an adequate alibi for continued exploitation. Neoliberalism was empire's new clothes. Before getting too into the weeds of the book, let me bring this back to myself. Because it was as I was wrangling with chapter 2 deep in some academic rabbit hole or another that I realized I wasn't just doing research, I was doing research. Specifically, I was trying to track down the policies, people, and ideologies that had led to me being born smack dab in the middle of fascists with guns, war, violence, and my mom in prison. And I was just sure I would find it somewhere in the Nixon administration, not Reagan. Some context. Iran was among a handful of nations that were never formally colonized by another nation. But after oil was discovered in 1910, it was colonized by a corporation, British Petroleum, whose original name was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They made a deal with Iran's corrupt rulers at the time, essentially to have exclusive rights to the oil without really paying for it, and sharing some of that wealth with the monarchy. The Iranian parliament immediately tried to resist by drawing up a new constitution that same year in 1910, 1911, and the British bombed parliament and justified it by saying that the Iranians were not capable of self-rule due to their lower standing on the racial hierarchy, too low for their votes to matter. The bombs and threats of bombs made clear that the oil deal was won, in the words of the godfathers of Vito Corleone, a deal Iran couldn't refuse. During the world wars, the British and Russians kept control of Iran's oil, which they desperately needed to win the war, bombing and again and again when their contracts came into trouble. After the war and all the new international treaties that basically prohibited the kind of coercion by bombing that the British had engaged in previously, the Iranian parliament tried again to regain control of their resources. The nation elected a prime minister, Mossadegh, around the 1950s, not a communist, in case you were wondering, told the British oil companies that they could no longer just take the nation's oil, they had to pay for it on the market. He demanded a market price. The UN Charter explicitly prevented the British to bomb Parliament again. So, or to use that same kind of racial hierarchy that the Nazis had used, race science, to say, well, these people are unfit to rule themselves. But without the oil, BP's profits could not be sustained. What to do? After some initial panic and hand-wringing and failed appeals to the international courts, the British roped the American CIA to stage a secret coup, Project Ajax, to get rid of Mossadegh. They hired a bunch of fake protesters who locked Mossadegh in his home, pretended to oust him. It worked. This was the CIA's first, but definitely not the last, of such coups to get rid of a guy they didn't like. After that, they armed their guy, the very young Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, with billions of dollars of weapons, which he used to torture dissenters. And he reigned for 30 years over a very unequal yet wealthy country, even as it was heralded by Nixon and his ilk as the only liberal democracy in the region. The revolution that occurred in 1978 was also, I argue, a right-wing backlash to neoliberalism and the legal corruption that tends to accompany its adoption. In other words, because of its unique status as a nation not formally colonized, Iran was the first country to test the international order after the fall of empire, a decade before the global revolts of the 1960s, at which point the rest of the colonies did the same. And the first to get the full-scale neoliberal treatment, and also the first to experience an extreme backlash in the form of right-wing populism turned fascism. What does fascism have to do with neoliberalism? You might be thinking, Well, neoliberalism said it did one thing, free markets and democracy, but it was in fact another thing, a legal cover, ideological and legal cover for extraction. And that kind of political corruption leads to inequalities, widespread distrust, which is the perfect breeding ground for demagogues and fascists promising to seek vengeance on behalf of the people on one group of scapegoat or another. In Iran in 1978, the fascists blamed America, Israel, women. They also promised justice and equality, but after the religious minorities were expelled, the witches were burnt and the college students were silenced. And so as you see, this book I called Quiet Coup could have been called Neoliberalism and Me. And it was me searched for another reason, because I was writing this book out of fear that what had happened there in Iran was happening here. Corruption and inequality bubbling up into distrust, revolution, and inevitably the fascists with their guns, religious texts, and another group of witches to burn that would fix everything. How can I even compare Islamic fundamentalism to what is happening here? I grant that there are many differences. The institutional safeguards here are much more robust than they were in pre-revolutionary Iran, after decades of dictatorship. But any ideology that commits injustice here and then points their finger out there to say God decreed it, or science explains it, or the market wills it and cannot be interfered with, feels like trouble to me. This brings me to another argument I make in the book, which is that justice is a feeling, a felt sense of morality or fairness, a common sense, in the words of Thomas Paine, that try as you might cannot be reasoned away with ideology. I can't prove this through the conventions of academic citation, but it is a knowledge that lives in my bones. I will tell you another story. I was visiting my mom in prison one time when I was around 6 or 7. She was one of the only mothers they held because my mother is very stubborn and would not give up a single name that the fascists, these young men and boys who the regime had turned into zombies with guns, wanted from her, of people in her group. So the prison officials, she was one of the only mothers they held, so the prison officials let my sister and I visit her every few weeks. So this one time while my mom was busy cleaning or whatever labor they had her doing, I followed a group of women to see a commotion in the yard and saw something I wasn't supposed to see, that my mother usually would have prevented me from seeing. These zombie men with guns were beating up an old woman who was on the ground. I could see her bare legs and bony shoulders. There were men kicking her, were holding guns, and one was holding a Quran, and she was begging them to stop and crying for help. I remember that moment as vividly as I remember anything in my childhood, because I had no words or explanation or understanding of how the world worked at the time, but my literal bones were radiating with the injustice of what I saw. And nothing I've ever heard or read or seen since has changed what I knew to be true right then. That justice is not possible in a world that allows such a thing to happen to the weak and vulnerable. Maybe you all come here to lectures about inequality because your bones know it too. Insofar as we live in a world where that can happen to a person, we live in an unjust world. I think when MLK said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, that was not just some poetic language, but literally true, insofar as we live in a society where a child is born in the wrong zip code or race, as Raj Chetty shows in his great work, will have little to no chance of escaping poverty. But where the top 1% have more money than they or their great-grandchildren can spend in a single lifetime, we live in an unjust society. When a kid has to worry about bombs and fascists with guns, she fears will kill her if her mandatory hijab falls off, but then crosses a border and gets a document that lets her live without worrying about any bombs. That is a kind of uncomfortable luck. At least that's how it has felt to me. Just because the injustice is over there, across the border, did not mean it wasn't a threat to justice here. The European empires also thought that they could use the ideology of racial superiority to murder and plunder over there, but it did not stay over there. The origins of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt's exploration of how European societies succumbed so quickly to totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, she concluded that they were primed for it by the mentality and practice of colonialism. European nations developed the economic logic of endless growth through violence during the scramble for Africa, she says. The logic and practice of empire that justified hundreds of years of ruthless exploitation abroad until it became a permanent supreme aim of politics was eventually, inevitably, imported back to Europe. It was colonialism, Arendt believed, that was the true origins of totalitarianism. The same legal structures and ideologies of racial superiority that enabled the British, French, Spanish, Germans, Belgians to commit atrocities over there were effectuated by the Third Reich on Europe itself. Foucault called the phenomenon the imperial boomerang. Amy Césaire, along the same line, said that Nazism was a symptom of a society sick with colonization, not an aberration. What I learned from my research into chapter 2 was that the geopolitical laws of karma, boomerang, are still in effect. For to install neoliberalism abroad, Western nations had to hollow out other people's democracies through covert and overt coups. This Australian economist and MPS leading light Ludwig von Mises made exactly this point about Iran. He says, if it is right for the British to nationalize the British coal mines, it cannot be wrong for the Iranians to nationalize the Iranian oil industry. Mises was not arguing that Iranians should be able to nationalize and control their resources. Rather, he was saying that the British should lose theirs, biting off the nose to spite the face. Social justice was a mirage, said Hayek, and they made it so. In other words, to defeat the moral consensus of the time that all nations had the right to self-determination, the neoliberals had to prioritize the rights of capital over people and to subvert the sovereignty of nation states to the property rights of international corporations. And you cannot justify coups abroad without effectuating one at home. Rather, the coup boomeranged back into coups figurative and literal of one's own democracy. And that is what the rest of the chapters of my book show. The coup that has happened inside the American legal structure. The separation, you might say, of justice from law, which is another way of describing corruption. So here we are, a week away from an election where fascism is not only on the ballot, but might in fact win. Fascism being a facile remedy to perceived injustice. This is why I began the book with Marjorie Taylor Greene and her theory of Jewish space lasers having caused catastrophic campfires in California that killed 100 people and destroyed a town. She explained, I don't know if you all remember this, but she explained her theory in a viral Facebook post when she blamed the Rothschilds for space lasers that had created the fire. I took 6 years to explain the corrupt legal system that enabled PG&E, the true cause of the fire, to keep issuing dividends to shareholders while recklessly ignoring legal mandates to upgrade equipment after knowing that it was 100 years old and was endangering lives, after causing several other fires and being held criminally liable for 100 other manslaughter cases in courts, and then never paying out any claims to victims because of their clever use of bankruptcy courts to wipe away their tort liabilities. I think people smelled something wrong, and she gave them a facile explanation that had to do with some scapegoat group. In other words, our legal system has allowed those with enough resources to evade justice through law. I helped them do it as a banking lawyer on Wall Street. Read my first 2 books. That gap between justice and law, that is the gap that worries me, because therein lies corruption and hypocrisy. And that gap only grows with time. Queen is just one of a growing cadre of people who has simple villains like the Rothschilds to blame for what is in fact a legal system that is increasingly formalistic, rigid, and prone to corruption. The fire was not caused by the Rothschilds. If you read my very long book, I think you will have a better picture of why regular old political corruption helped cause those fires, and that there was something fishy going on. It just had to do with the revolving door and shareholder supremacy laws and et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing I realized to my horror, that Marjorie Taylor Greene and I, see how that sentence structure is so uncomfortable. Marjorie Taylor Greene and I, that she and I have the same feeling of injustice, and that her explanations were more salient and popular. I had to write a whole footnoted book about it that probably a handful of people will read. And her simplistic and wrong reasons made her head of the most powerful bloc of Congress and among the top 5 Republican fundraisers. I think, and I suspect, that there is a balancing scale of injustice in each of us, and I think it's off kilter in each of us. Except for not all of us have access to these resources. Some of us need to explain it quicker, faster. That sense or feeling of injustice is big and it's forceful, but it's nonverbal, blunt, and binary. Justice is a feeling, and I suspect it's a feeling we all share. And what happens when the gap between justice and law becomes too large is, I think, what happened in Iran, which is revolution, violence, etc. It's not just Iran. Consider Germany in 1919. At the Treaty of Versailles, the British, Americans, and the French imposed war reparations for World War I on the Germans, who had to pay $133 billion to the French and British. It would take them 92 years to pay back. launch their economy into just debt. A young economist named John Maynard Keynes was at the meeting, and he was appalled. He called President Wilson the greatest fraud in history for letting the French and the British talk him into imposing this crushing debt. Published his first book that year, The Economic Consequences of Peace. It's very, very good, especially now. It's very relevant. In which he says that economic inequalities and war and violence are very much tied together. Here is what he says about the reparations payments that will go into the coffers of the French and British. French, by the way, who have demanded reparations from Haiti since the Haitians won their independence back then, billions of dollars of reparations. Maynard Keynes says, if we take the view that for at least a generation to come, year by year, Germany must keep impoverished, we must keep Germany impoverished and her children starved and crippled, not allowing Germany to regain a part of her former material prosperity, find a means of livelihood for the industrial populations of her towns. Heaven help us all. If we aim deliberately at the impoverishment of Germany, vengeance, I dare predict, will not limp. Nothing can then delay for very long that final civil war between the forces of reaction and the despairing convulsions of revolutions, for which the horrors of the late German war will fade into nothing, and which will destroy whoever is victor, the civilization and the progress of our generation. Must we not believe that the prosperity and happiness of one country promotes that of others, that the solidarity of man is not a fiction, that nations can still afford to treat other nations as fellow creatures? Keynes wrote this in 1919, the same year that Adolf Hitler began his political rise. He was jailed several times, Hitler, and opposed until 1933 when he came to power. The Germans suffered greatly under that great debt. It was unremitting for over a decade until they adopted the Third Reich's final solution. In other words, something fishy was going on. It was just a simple contract that was done at the Treaty of Versailles. It wasn't the elders of Zion and the scapegoats that typically get blamed for this stuff. See Marjorie Taylor Greene. Back to the scary story, that was just table setting. I struggled in this book to really to paint a picture of how ideology can corrupt a culture. Sure, there are villains in the story I tell about neoliberalism, i.e. Nixon and all, but the real villains are the ideas that justify injustice and that self-reproduce their own logic through law and policy. Like neoliberalism, before a divine right, social Darwinism, these ideas get embedded into the law and capital code, and they create the market and a society based on their own value system. So neoliberalism is the ideology that there's a market out there apart from people, and that its dictates should govern society rather than the will of the people. The free market would eventually deliver liberty and prosperity insofar as capital was freed from democracy. In fact, the market is a creation of society. There's no such thing as a market outside the legal structure, and law is based on the democratically elected consent of the governed, if you will. I teach contracts over there in every aspect of the market. From the creation of the law, contracts, money, capital, securities, property rights, all of it has a history and a creation moment. It is not out there. The market is constructed by judges and lawyers and legislators. For example, when I teach property law, I sometimes start with a Supreme Court case called Johnson versus McIntosh, which is a property dispute involving two separate deeds to the same plot of land, 1823. Two private individuals had purchased a plot of land. One purchased the land from a Native American tribe that had occupied it forever, and one from the US government. And Justice John Marshall decided that only the deed purchased from the US government, both were valid deeds, only the US one was valid, because although the Native American tribes had occupied the land, they had no property rights that a court was bound to respect because they were, and I quote, savages, who weren't using the land in the proper way that the natural law of the time decided to John Locke, who was a purveyor of that particular ideology, were using it. So they were savages and couldn't own property rights for that reason. And missing the irony of the logic that the US did have the right, they had gained it by the sword. So they're savages, but those who had defeated them with a sword were the true heirs of the power. This 1823 decision then paved the way for the Trail of Tears, plunder of 1.5 billion acres of Native American land by the sword, backed by the law. That is property law. That was a property code that didn't exist before that decision. property rights, contract rights, capital itself, what is legally recognized as a unit of value, shifting and changing. Right now, we're in the world of derivatives. Once a court says, yes, a derivative is an asset, then it becomes one. Yes, that property is an asset, then it is so. There are legal constructions built on histories of power. There's no such thing as a pure market outside the law, and societies construct the law. There's no invisible hand, but the dead hand of legal precedent. Justice is not the same thing as law. Law is a set of codes that reflect the ideologies of any given time, some of which may be unjust. And it is ideologies that do the work of justifying unjust laws or changing them. Neoliberalism, as I make the claim in the book, was just the latest of these ideologies. At a time of worldwide transformation, an interregnum between one legal order and another, right? Wealthy heirs, segregationists, and the corporate tentacles of the dying empires kept the market rigged in their favor. It was hypocrisy from the start, because these would have been the losers of democracy and truly free markets. And in fact, I show in the book, it wasn't just all corporations that did this. It was the ones that were involved in empire, oil and gas, tobacco, weapons. Those were the funders of the neoliberal cadre of academics and the creators of the Nobel Prize and all of that. So neoliberal economics thwarted the pursuit of justice, racial justice first and foremost, but over time, neoliberal policies would capture the entire judicial system, because that worm of hypocrisy only grows. The spirit of the civil rights laws and the United Nations Declaration of Cooperation were replaced by the cold and dead letter. So the civil rights laws say color blindness, and they come in and make color blindness meaningless. Brown versus Board of Ed was essentially overturned a decade later, essentially through the logic of economic, this anti-capitalist to demand equality based on income as long as you're not actively segregated, etc. There's many examples in the book. Without the spirit of justice, the law is an empty and manipulable set of codes that any corporation can just use to effectuate their ends. The result then is widespread distrust, which has already grown into political resentment, and if left unchecked, I fear can lead to a breakdown of rule of law. Neoliberalism made the law into a zombie. It walks, this is a theme, I'm sticking with Halloween. It walks around and does stuff, but without justice, it is just an empty husk. Neoliberalism also supercharged capital's growth by delegitimating any limits imposed on it by the state. With its singular drive to grow by consuming whatever it can to turn into more yield, capital has become kind of a hungry ghost. Okay? Capital is an idea, it's a meme that can only grow. Once it became unrestrained from democracy, that was 30 years ago, all it can do is grow, and that's all it's been doing. It's very hard to see ideologies and systems as the villains that they are. And what ends up happening is that the fascists come in and start pointing at people. The thing that really scares me is that our problems are with ideologies that have us entrapped to serve their ends. Over the course of the book, I tried in many ways to help people visualize the problem and analogize the problem to a virus, a cancer, a parasite, a zombie. Each of these metaphors, from the real virus to the imagined zombie, references something that operates without head or heart, driven by a singular mission of self-replication. There's no alternative to neoliberalism, said Margaret Thatcher, and it so appears today, if only because neoliberal reforms tied our well-being to the market's well-being. The dystopian future that we worry about with AI overpowering humanity seems already at hand, and it looks like a relentless growth of capital through the murky, yield-extracting legal mechanisms of finance. The self-replicating nature of the virus means that the pools of capital will keep growing exponentially. The billions of the top 0.01% will soon metastasize into trillions. And as the economic chasm between rich and poor grows, so too will our political divides. We are all under the boot of this false notion of a market, which is now what I call in the end a big, dumb machine. It's yield extracting, but it's really hard to see the source of the pressure through the vast multitudes of corporate entities and abstract financial products. Harder still, to devise a policy or political agenda to decode a viral ideology or wage war against the metastatic growth of zeros and ones in portfolio funds and endowment funds. It's much easier to blame It's much easier to feel the pressure and look around for a group of humans to blame. Nor can neoliberalism be defeated through repeated debunkings because its free market theories were false advertising from the start. The neoliberal coup resulted in a maze of complexity and the proliferation of agencies and laws that hide what is essentially an unfair market. So to say, you have this opposition to neoliberalism saying, well, this is capitalism, this is free markets, then socialism. But it's a myth. It wasn't capitalism. It wasn't free markets from the beginning. That's my claim. Financialization is actually killing the market by sucking money out of the economy's circulatory system. And its fruits, money in the hands of a few, is killing democracy and our ability to do anything about it. So to get out from under the boot of an unthinking and unfeeling zombie, the law must be made to feel and the market to think. Neoliberalism in law is a set of formulas and textual analysis that I go through in the book. It's law and economics, it's textualism. That both of those strands, for the Federalist Society, that was textualism, and law and economics, which was cost-benefit analysis, were funded by right-wing donors and now have taken over the law. They work hard to keep feelings and intuitions out of judicial decision-making. That is their point. But justice, again, is a shared feeling that cannot be faked. It either exists or doesn't. To achieve justice, the legal system must be recalibrated to measure it, rather than just what is profitable or what is efficient. Likewise, to restore trust in our institutions, they must become trustworthy. Back to the theme, neoliberalism, back to the theme, my Halloween theme. Neoliberalism was a trick. Now here's the treat. I opened the book with this, I can't use this speech again, you guys, I just made it. Okay. I opened the book with this Baldwin quote. Time catches up with kingdoms and crushes them, gets its teeth into doctrines and rends them. Time reveals the foundations on which any kingdom rests and eats at those foundations, and it destroys doctrines by proving them to be untrue. Ideologies like neoliberalism, having been false and hypocritical from the start, do not last long. It's already succumbing to its own internal contradictions. The market did not, in fact, deliver liberty and prosperity for all. Neoliberalism's greatest spokesman, Ronald Reagan, urged world leaders at the UN in 1984 to trust in the magic of the market. And the magic market would deliver freedom and equality. Try to use the government to achieve justice, he said. He warned, and you were well on your way down the road of serfdom and to tyranny. But it was a false binary, state versus market. For what neoliberalism offered was an unholy alliance between both. Regulators captured by industry, corporations buying laws through lobbyists. It was tyranny on both sides. Magic was actually a sleight of hand that convinced people to relinquish their social welfare states and benefits rather than share them with their undeserving neighbors. In other words, for Iran, for us to oppose Iran nationalizing their oil, the British would have to not have nationalized industries as well. They lost their social welfare state so that they didn't have to share it with Black Americans. That's what happened in the Nixon administration, as I showed in my last book. Instead of expanding the social safety nets of the New Deal, eradicating them as soon as Black Americans asked to be included. The real human magic, so that's the false magic, right? But the real human magic that has enlivened human societies from ancient times to present is the magic of trust. Market magic is the coordination of mutual exchange with strangers through trust. The empires did not want to do that. People who proclaimed free markets the loudest were the ones who least understood them. Like justice, which has an unavoidable denominator problem, i.e., it must be shared by all to exist at all. Free markets cannot be achieved unless all are free to participate. In fact, justice is a prerequisite for freedom, and freedom is a prerequisite for free markets, which is what the anti-colonial leaders were trying to say all along. To Thomas Paine, it was common sense that all men being originally equals, no one by birth could have a right to set up his own family in perpetual preference to all others forever. But it wasn't yet common sense that women or other races were equal. And so in the 1960s, movements had to say it again. This is common sense that all are created equal. Still, there was too much fear and too much greed to live in peace. New ideologies were created even then to recreate the old order of empire, but under new rules like money and debt. But time rends. We are again at this precipice, justice and freedom and peace, or guns and fear and separation. What is undeniable to me is that we as a global humanity, because that is the most commonsensical truth about us all, that we are all one, that we will tip in one direction or another and soonish, because this state of precarious inequality is unsustainable. My bet is that we make it. Because of what I see in my own children, my students, and those in this room, we refuse to ignore the felt sense of injustice that we cannot deny. My bet is that we make it by betting on it. We get the future we want by investing in it and disinvesting from this current suicide pact among militaries, by investing in new ideas and new policies, by achieving a truly free market emphasis on freedom. I have a lot more to say about this in the book, but please forgive me if I leave that for another lecture or the Q&A. With that, I will end my remarks and open it up.
Well, it's nice to get a very careful, precise doctrinal analysis from our law professor, right?
Yes.
I have about, I don't know, 5 or 6 pages to go, have those questions and so on. So let me just ask one and then open up, because I'm sure lots of people have lots of things to say. And I can't resist my Trumpist question, not about him as an individual. I'm sick to death of talking about him.
Sick of it. Yeah.
But the sort of the broadly speaking MAGA movement, whatever that means, whatever the Republican Party has transformed into over the last half dozen years. And I think there's like a bunch of different strands. And I wonder if you see them, how you see them as related to neoliberalism. I guess that's my question. So one is clearly the neoliberalism, the neoliberal strand. Get government out of, deregulate, eliminate taxes, especially for the well-off, free the market. And that's clearly, I think, would fit in any definition.
Yeah.
There's also a social conservative strand, right? I mean, most obviously having to do with abortion politics, but more broadly, religion, school bans on books, and so on and so forth. I think that's just separate, but I don't know how they fit together. A third strand is kind of a populism, right? I am your savior. I will take care of you. I will take care of women, whether they want it or not. A fourth strand is kind of totalitarian, only I can do it, enemy of the people. So I think neoliberalism is there. And again, I'm going to talk about kind of the movement or the phenomena, not the individual, or any particular individual. I see neoliberalism as part of that, but it seems to me it's a much more complicated and sometimes internally contradictory societal phenomenon that we're all living through, in which neoliberalism, if you follow Gary Gerstl's argument, is actually a declining element of, and the social conservatism, populism, authoritarianism is rising. And so maybe neoliberalism is on its way out.
It is.
And these other things on their way in. But not justice, at least as I would understand it, nicer than you would.
Yes.
Question mark at the end of that. I'm not sure. I think there's a question there.
No, it's definitely, in fact, I would say the whole book is motivated by answering that question. Again, like the book is motivated in understanding the phenomenon. And this is why I bring my personal experience to it, because I think the exact same thing happened in Iran, which is you fear, when you install these neoliberal reforms or whatever, that sort of ideology of corporations and like liberty in that neoliberal sense of liberty, and lose focus on equality and democracy, you fear that opposition is coming from the left. So what Straw did is sort of, to eliminate the left. And in this country, we've had this, capitalism versus socialism dichotomy, but often the effective response to neoliberalism, which I'm just going to call political corruption, because that's how it's acted. There's the theories, but then what's happened is actually just more money in politics. Not because I don't believe there is no such thing as a capitalist free market in this current system. It's not possible. Maybe it's possible, but we don't have that. We have lobbyists making laws. Finance is now 70% of the economy. That's not capitalism. So when you have that, usually an effective response to it comes from the right. And this is the thing I think when we think, the United States is unique from other nations, we're not looking at what's happening in Brazil or in Europe or in the Middle East, which is that the right is very effective at a response to corruption also. It's not the left. The left has been, eradicated for the most part. And, even the left was misunderstood at the time. Stalin was hardly communist. That's not communism. It's the Gulag. That's authoritarianism. That's also totalitarianism.
Stalin on the left, I would say, but
it's not left, right? There was right. So I think it's that dichotomy between capitalism and socialism was also neoliberalism's doing. That also hatched in the Nixon administration, this political rhetoric. So I think that's where we go wrong in describing neoliberalism as one, the Reagan policy agenda. That's Gary Versel's point in his book, is that, and a lot of neoliberal critics take neoliberalism's own description as truth, which is that this is about economics. It's about macroeconomic theory of markets in opposition to Keynesianism. And I part with that. I'm saying it was a different thing. And in that different thing, Trumpism is very much tied in. I think Trumpism, I see as in line with everything that's happening around the world, which is a renewed right. That is, if you deny race, if you put these things aside and say, oh, it's just markets now, you've kind of enforced a false thinking about race, and race cannot be ignored. And so that right-wing populism is coming out, and it's antagonistic to these myths of, oh, we fixed the civil rights era, we got global justice. We didn't. The civil rights era was killed in its crib. The global justice movements didn't succeed. They died. And they were killed in a lot of ways. And that's the world we still live in, is it extended, 30 years hence, we still live in, we haven't figured out what to do post-empire. We haven't got to justice. And I think the right understands that more than the left does.
Question. Do you want to call people? What do you want me to do?
I'll call, sure, yeah.
So much for your talk. You did tell us some horrifying stories, but I appreciate you telling your personal stories, really resonant. I have a request and then a question. I think it would be helpful for all of us for the discussion if you could just define what you mean by neoliberalism, so that while we're sitting here today, we have a shared understanding of that term, which is, I think, multivalent. And then my question is sort of twofold. You said that many people identify the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s. You identify it as a rising in the 1970s. And I just want to know what sort of evidence you bring to that determination. What made you weigh for and against these two different explanations for this is the time when neoliberalism arose? And I want just a little bit of clarification on the extent to which you see your argument about neoliberalism to be a functionalist argument, which is sort of how I'm hearing it. Neoliberalism exists to serve a purpose. It rose for, and it's not a very popular form of argumentation right now, a functionalist form of argumentation. And I want to know if I'm just understanding the argument correctly and how you're thinking about it.
Thank you for all this. Okay, what is neoliberalism? I spend a lot of time in the beginning because it's what it says it is, and I'll say what it says it is. In 1951, Milton Friedman, one of the neoliberals, main spokesman, writes an article called Neoliberalism and Its Prospects, in which he puts out the word neoliberalism as the umbrella term for their movement, which is that markets, the free markets, sort of a neo-Ricardian, neo-Adam Smith, that capitalism and markets should be prioritized over sort of government intervention in them, right? So that we should prioritize, he talks about shareholder supremacy, that shareholders' value should be more important than like social justice, and Hayek also in that mixes, aim at social justice and you get to tyranny, aim at free markets and you get social justice in the meantime or something, right? So it's this broadly, it's about a market being prioritized over sort of governance. However, it's really tricky for several reasons. One is that neoliberalism now means both everything and nothing. There's like Burnham episodes about neoliberalism, and like everyone's a neoliberal except for like Bernie Sanders or something. So there's the current dialogue, but there is, I use it anyway because the academic consensus is at least pretty within a range, even if I'm disagreeing with some parts of it. Generally, the academic consensus is a slate of economic policies or legal policies that start roughly in the Reagan administration, and I'll talk about why I think, which free up capital. So there's the end of Bretton Woods, which allows capital to go anywhere. That's the early part, and that's Nixon, and I'll talk about why I think that's the first neoliberal salvo. But broadly, Reagan, it's like 401ks rather than pensions. It's shareholder rights rather than employee rights. It's lower, less unions, less tax cuts for the rich and not, benefits for the bottom. That whole slate of policies is broadly called neoliberalism. But it's a contested definition. It's a really tricky one, but that's generally what we think about when we talk about neoliberalism. Gary Gerstle and others make a great, I think observation that it is our dominant political order. We live in a neoliberal world, and I focus on the international stuff, especially because it's much more clear to see it there. Right? So the IMF regime, international debt, that very much comes in the neoliberal pivot as well. Why the 1960s and not 1980s? So the typical neoliberal story goes like this. There's this first meeting, Mont Pelerin Society in 1944 up in the Vermont mountains, and then it's 1980 when you have Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan that effectuate this policy. That's a large gap. When you look at the people and the things that they're writing, neoliberal there's an interregnum where voices are kind of speaking. I have a slide that shows some of these are the leading lights of the neoliberal movement that I talk about. They're starting in the 50s, 40s and 50s, and very much, at least Stigler, Friedman, a couple others are very much, it's a post-Brown push, right? Brown versus Board of Ed is a very pivotal case in the legal world because it completely overturns the Jim Crow order with one case, and it leaves a lot of people unhappy, obviously, but it also fundamentally deals a blow to the law. It's like, what can law be based on if you can overturn a whole legal order with a footnote about if this is bad for kids, right? So there's this movement around that time to really fix the law to something. So one, the Federalist Societies developed fix it to textualism and law and economics to economics. But in their writings, and I try to show as much as I can in the book, they're very much motivated by that post-Brown moment. Specifically in the Nixon administration, his policy on race, his main advisor is Alan Greenspan, who creates the ideology of Black capitalism, which is my last. Right. When I was in the archives looking at that, it's just very clear that Nixon is working with, with Goldwater, Greenspan, and these right-wing sort of libertarian ideologues to craft his race strategy, and it becomes neoliberalism later on, but starts there. George Shultz is a Nixon advisor who becomes Reagan's, OMBE head. All sorts of the leading lights of the neoliberal movement start with Nixon, and that's when the plan is hatched. So that's why 1960s. It's a functionalist argument. It's I'm a law person, so we, the norms of legal scholarship are maybe a little bit different, and I am actually just talking about the law and its the trajectory of legal change. And the law, that I focus on is corporate law, banking law, financial law. You really can't understand these cases without understanding who pushed them, who are the different sides, what Supreme Court justice decided what rule. So that's the book. I think it's a functionalist in the way that I presented it today. I think the scholarship itself is much more about following exactly what case led to what law and why. And that, I think it's more just dot connecting rather than trying to make a functionalist argument to ignore what they said. I don't think I'm trying to say that. Yes.
Thank you for a very fascinating talk. I guess one question I have is, so your account of neoliberalism seems somewhat consistent with kind of revisionist accounts by Quinn Slobodian and Globalists,
Yes.
and Nancy McLean, Democracy in Chains. And I'm really curious, and to hear you think about how we think about this.
And Melinda Cooper.
Of course, yeah, Melinda Cooper and her
Which
book
I
on
reviewed
family
this
values,
yes.
and which speaks to this question of neoconservatism and neoliberalism's alliance. And so I'm interested in kind of how we think about neoliberalism as this project of encasement of the markets from democracy through this global kind of this era, and the kind of anti-democracy of now, which seems to be a kind of a backlash, a protectionist, the family is in the fore, the nation is in the fore, race. So yeah, they seem like different forms of anti-democracy, right? And I'd be curious to see. I still don't know how to. I think part of the question is in sort of this alliance between neoconservatisms and neoliberals, and now that the family and race and nation are kind of out of they've kind of taken over in this alliance. But I don't quite know how.
Yeah, I think what my book asks, and that's right. I'm not. The part about neoliberalism over democracy and that is response to race is I'm in good company. Our books came out around the same time. My second book also puts forward this whole Black capitalism thing was neoliberalism, and it comes in direct response to the civil rights movement. Nothing to do with Keynesianism, right? The economy was swimming before neoliberalism. As far as what the argument, the broader one, it's sort of like a metaphysical point, but I want to follow along Hannah Arendt's insight about the ideology of colonialism out there leading to Nazism at home, saying you cannot subvert other people's democracies without doing that damage inside. So I really think it's connected in that you create these right-wing institutions, and in the book it's not amorphous. It's like this institution, the AEI, it's Heritage Foundation, it's Law and Economics, it's these things to do in Chile what they did, to do in Iran what they did, and not have those organizations. They're representing the same international corporations, the same weapons manufacturers, the same oil and gas, to change the law at home as well. So it's connected in that way as well. So just as that injustice is connected, we are suffering, right? We lost our democracy because those groups justified over subverting other people's democracy. And you can't, it's connected. You cannot take over and say, oh, Chile can't have a democracy because we need their property, which is what happened with Allende. And then say, oh, we get to keep ours. We don't. When we haven't. So this coup on the Capitol, right? People said, well, this is the kind of thing that happens in third world countries. Well, yes. And that the fact that it happened here was new and shocking to many, but not to anyone who's lived in one of those countries. And understood that it's a very similar logic that happens. And I guess the point is that we're not separate in bad and good ways. We're not separate.
Thank you for your talk. I have an observation, even in domestic politics, during the midterm elections, there was some observation that the Democratic Party supported or advocated for the magma candidate to win in the primaries as a short-term way to win the general election. Do you see any kind of rationality?
It's really hard to make the arguments about neoliberalism in this two-party system because you have Harris coming out with the Cheney's at this point, right? The Cheney's. Not having neoliberalism is not on the ballot. I want to say that for Trump voters, some of them are functionally, let's say, against neoliberalism, and they think that that's the answer. And so I think for a lot of people, the jobs being gone, at least verbally, what he says, like any good demagogue, right, is that I will fix problems. Whereas the left, the Democrats, aren't saying, maybe verbally, but the record isn't quite there. And so if you are the economically depressed, and look at immigration being a primary motivator, the communities for whom immigration is the hardest tangibly are those communities that have the lowest incomes, right? So inequality, you have that sort of scarcity being imposed on certain communities, and then immigrants going to those communities that gives rise to nationalism, all that. So economically, yeah, and as far as Democrats funding, yeah, that's just political strategy. And I mean, money. This I usually give this talk, and it's very much more detailed. So if you really want details here, they are there. Legal changes. The whole point of this is that they said we're going to do less laws. And what we got was more laws, more complexity, more lobbying. The rise of finance. Here, this slide. I follow the trajectory of Lewis Powell on the court, post-Buckley versus Vallejo. This is how much we spent. Maybe you've seen this, but I trace it to the Supreme Court cases. But recently, we just went over. So, the 2020 election was $14 billion. We are now, I think, double that every year. every election cycle, it's that much more money. So you've got billions of dollars. I think Kamala Harris raised $1 billion in a week this cycle. That's directly a result of Lewis Powell's tenure on the court, who's one of my neoliberal heroes or villains. All of those last 5 cases basically were from Virginia Pharmacy to Central Hudson were about giving corporations First Amendment rights and allowing money in politics. And that was Lewis Powell is the guy that wrote this Powell memo, which launches the neoliberal right-wing circuit, and then he becomes Nixon's Supreme Court justice and really plants the bombs in that time that blow up in Citizens United later on. So Lewis Powell is the architect in both strands of the legal movement of neoliberalism. And he is also, by the way, Richmond, Virginia school board lawyer, very gifted lawyer, segregationist, who instead of doing the bad, the massive resistance that the South does, manages to not integrate Richmond schools through rezoning. So only 3 kids have to change schools after Brown in Richmond, Virginia, because of Lewis Powell. And Nixon, he's like 74 or something when Nixon puts him on the court, which is usually you want to get a young guy to live long. He says 2 years with Powell is worth it. And it was. And he did a lot of damage. This last case that he did, Marquette, not Marquette, but yeah, I think so. Anyway, one of the Marquette cases is he deregulated, like single-handedly, interest rates, usury rate caps, used to be state by state. And after this case in 1978, a bank could charter in South Dakota or Utah and export those interest rates, which were none. They had no interest rate caps in those states everywhere in the country. So now you've got the creation of like payday lending and these very exploitative debt system that I've spent my other books talking about. That is also Justice Powell, and Robert Bork is the leader of that movement. So it's the same group of guys here. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I'm somewhat older than this audience. I'm probably the oldest here. I've been teaching this for 30 years here at the Kennedy School. So I'm delighted to see the political economy of the present. You don't say anything about Hobson or Lenin's theory of imperialism and its relationship to capitalism, which were central features of the way that the Western left argued about issues that you're raising as relatively novel or relatively post-Second World War. And I don't understand why, because it would seem to be important that you have a longer continuity. The second is, I don't hear in what you're saying a political strategy for addressing or challenging these institutions. If we stay within the electoral system, a lot of the trauma that leads to the Clinton era is in the McGovern defeat of 1972, when he loses 49 of 50 states. It utterly delegitimized the tradition of New Deal liberalism. And you have to take account if you're going to work within political electoral systems. If you're not, then we need to start sketching it out. So I'd love to, both history and sort of future would be what I'd like to hear.
Well, you gather your thoughts. These are 2 fabulous questions,
Yeah.
no surprise, of course. So I'm giving you a chance to answer both of them, and then we're going to have to say thank you very much because we're getting close to running out of time, and we have to wrap up.
Okay, great.
I'll wave my arms if we get.
Yeah, history, I mean, already this book was so much. I couldn't. I mean, I read so much for this. I mean, 6 years and I couldn't, I had to start with Nixon. I could not. And that's why chapter 2 was so difficult, because that's the chapter I had to bring in everything else. So I couldn't, I hear there are other people have made these arguments in a lot of different ways. Despite my big talk today, this book is just from Nixon to now. That really is what I'm talking about. Even the 1960s revolts globally, I'm not going back further than that. Like, my idea is going to drop if I did. So I couldn't. But I do, I mean, talk in law and bring in John Locke and natural law and those ideologies because, and that's maybe why you're saying, well, if you're going to bring up Locke, why not bring up Hobbes? But because Lockeism is very much still alive in the property code and in the contract. So but I would love to hear, afterwards, maybe what I could, as far as forward. So the book, I don't think there's an electoral strategy. I do, however, conclude oddly, given all that I've said, that there are market ways to do it. That we must not see this dichotomy that we're stuck in, that only justice can be done through the political realm, because the political realm has been thoroughly captured, I think. The Senate is, even if, Trump gets defeated as the White House, we lose the Senate. And I was the nominee for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency during the last Biden administration. We got no nominees for any banking agencies. We had the Senate, we just couldn't get mentions. So after that, that's also led to part of my despair in writing this book, is like, if we can't even reform this tiny little realm, how do we get around this? And part of it has to do with money, part of it has to do with these cases that have really constrained that. Part of it has to do with the fact that we live in a slaveholders' constitution, that the Senate was purposefully a block to reform and continues to be. So that, and I think our problems, the erosion and unraveling is happening faster than we could fix it through the political means. The market, however, I still have faith in. Not the market as it is, but look, the constitutional charter was based on a corporate charter. Back in the John Stuart Mill era, there were, you look at the British Empire, it was half corporation, half chartered state, and there's no reason a corporate model different than what we have now couldn't also serve as a coordinating of people sort of legal charter. And I don't have an answer like, oh, invest in this company, that's not me, but I do have faith in the creative efforts of people to do that kind of thing. And I am still thinking through it, but I have tried to flag some things in the book about ways to actually invest in these places and use money, use the power that we have through money being actually having more rights than people, more votes, more, shareholders are supreme, and therefore shareholders maybe can make a dent. I'm not saying like invest in ESG, but I am saying that the market is easier if you're interested in justice. We've been in a system for 30 years of like, it's got to be through laws. And I think that it doesn't have to be. More out of despair, more out of it's so broken over there that maybe there's some hope over here if we focus on it. I'm not saying, look, I know, look, this is, now I'm going to start to piss off left people. I'm just saying it's a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. We don't have, if it's gone, it's gone. And we got to be realistic. And I do not think we don't have that much time. It's 75 degrees out, you guys.